Welcome to this webinar on decontamination of medical devices in loan stores and how this affects you. Just a quick disclaimer to start off with. I'm not a qualified compliance practitioner, and the information being presented here is based on a fair interpretation of the regulations, and really it's just aimed at raising awareness that these regulations exist and that you need to think about them. And you should always seek professional advice on this kind of topic. And I also have a vested interest in that my company sells compliant products. However, I hope this doesn't detract from the information being given. At the end of the day, what we want is for loan stores to be using compliant products and processes, regardless of where they come from. So where does this apply? This applies in England, Wales and Scotland and excludes Ireland, both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because the medical device regulation border has been drawn in the Irish Sea and not on the Irish land. So from the end of May 2021, Ireland will be following the new European regulations, and at this point the Great Britain rather than UK will be diverging away. And also this presentation is only seeking to cover the decontamination equipment and chemicals element of that. We're not trying to cover all the elements of the regulation. So which regulations are we talking about? Well, we're talking about what's commonly known as the MDD, the Medical Device Directive, which is confusingly known in UK law as the MDR because we changed the name of it, and also the European new regulation is generally known as the MDR, but it's this regulation that's been in place in UK law since 2002, which regulates medical devices. Just worth a mention here, I'm not covering it further in the presentation, but there is a standard for automated washer disinfectors. This is ISO 15883. There are a number of parts to it. The only parts that you need to be concerned about are parts 1, 6 and 7. So if you're looking at washer disinfectors in loan stores, you need to be aware of that standard and products needing to comply with it as well. But I'm not covering that any further in this presentation. I'm focusing on the Medical Device Directive. So the first thing to underline is that legal regulations are not optional, they are legal. And there have been a number of high-profile cases where companies, big and small, run into problems with this. In our industry, Invacare had a major incident in the USA with the FDA. We're all aware of what happened with Volkswagen and Dieselgate. It happens to any and every company. You do need to take this seriously. And also, commercial concerns are not a valid excuse for non-compliance. You can't say it's too expensive to comply. That just doesn't stand up in law. So there's a number of really fine detailed pieces to these regulations, and it's all down in the wording. So I'm going to bring out a little bit of that here and try and give you a sense of what it's trying to cover. So how is a medical device defined in the first place? I've taken out from the regulation here a piece of the text. There is more to it than this, and there's a lot of fine detail as to how things are worded. But at the end of the day, most of the devices that a loan store is reprocessing are classified as medical devices. And the regulation does say that anything that is used for the cleaning and disinfection of medical devices is also a medical device, and that's really the main point I'm trying to make here. But it's really important to note that whether something's a medical device or not really comes from what a manufacturer claims of their device, and we're going to cover that a few times through this presentation as it is very important. Once something is actually defined as a medical device, there is also the classifications, and there are 4 general classifications based on risk, and I'll pull out a couple of important ones here. So all devices which are intended specifically for disinfecting medical devices need to be class 2A. That's very important. And so anything that is used to disinfect invasive equipment is class 2B. Okay, a loan store is unlikely to be reprocessing invasive equipment, but just so you're aware, there are these different levels within the system. But you also need to bear in mind that disinfectants, although it's a chemical, it's not a physical device. We're used to the idea of a physical device, but the disinfectant is considered a device, and therefore it needs to be 2A because it's designed and intended for use on medical devices. Also worth noting that any device that is intended to be used for cleaning medical devices, and not disinfecting but cleaning, needs to be class 1. From a manufacturer's point of view, this is a slightly easier accreditation process, but all the same it needs to be there. So what does this really mean for disinfectants used in loan stores? It doesn't mean that all disinfectants need to be Class 2A medical devices. Again, it comes down to what they're being used for. So a general floor or surface disinfectant does not need to be classified as a medical device because it's not intended for that. It's intended for generic floors or surfaces. So it's fine to have those, but it's a case of what you use them on. It does mean that you should not be using those disinfectants on medical devices, even though you may think or feel they're safe to do so. They actually haven't gone through the accreditation and safety processes to make sure that they are safe for use in that way. So in all community equipment stores, all loan stores, disinfectant chemicals need to be used on the right type of devices. So if you're using a disinfectant on medical devices, and most of what you reprocess is medical devices, then it needs to be Class 2A and nothing less. Let's just take a moment to talk about accessories, because this is important in the overall medical device definitions. So anything that is an accessory to a medical device is also in itself defined as a medical device. That sounds simple, but it's not quite as simple as that, because it comes down to how accessories are defined. I've got the definition here, again very specific wording in here, and just like with the main definition, it really comes down to what a manufacturer intends for its device, what it is claiming about its device. So I'll just run through an example which will hopefully illustrate this. So let's take a spray bottle. Now you could use a spray bottle to spray water, you could use it to spray a medical device disinfectant. Now does the fact that it's being used in that way make the bottle a medical device or not? So if the manufacturer is just a manufacturer of generic bottles, they just say this is a spray bottle. It is designed to be used to spray liquids, and they don't have any specific intent around what kind of liquid is being sprayed. So because that's the case, just because you're putting a medical device, i.e. a chemical disinfectant in there, doesn't mean that the bottle suddenly becomes an accessory because the manufacturer is not making it to be an accessory. The chemical disinfectant directed on medical device does need to be a Class 2A, but not the bottle. And also when you think about generic floor disinfectants or surface disinfectants, again both the disinfectant and the bottle have no requirement to be medical devices. You could imagine that a manufacturer might have a disinfectant and a spray bottle designed together. So let's say the droplet size needs to be exactly right, and therefore the nozzle of the bottle is specifically designed to work with that disinfectant, or it has a special mixing mechanism or something like that. When they're designed to be used together and specifically together, then both the bottle and the disinfectant are Class 2A medical devices because they work together as a single unit. One is an accessory to the other. So a lot of loan stores will use thermal washer disinfectors on their medical devices. Now because the actual machine is doing the disinfection through the application of heat, that makes the machine a Class 2A medical device. So if you're using a thermal washer disinfector or you're looking to procure one, you need to make sure that it is a Class 2A medical device at least. And then there are washers which use or apply disinfectants, and this is a little bit more nuanced. So the fact that it is doing cleaning means that the washer in itself as a washer needs to be Class 1. However, the application of the disinfectant can be seen a bit more like our generic spray bottle design. So as long as the machine is not specifically designed to specifically work with a specific disinfectant, then it doesn't make it a Class 2A machine. The disinfectant, because you're applying it to medical devices, does need to be 2A, but the machine does not need to be 2A because it is not doing the disinfecting, it is the chemical that's doing the disinfecting. It could be perceived, again taking that last example from my spray bottle, that if a machine and a disinfectant are specifically designed to work together, so let's say the machine performs a mixing action or prepares the chemical in some way or offers some kind of special conditioning for the chemical, so they're specifically designed to work together, then both the machine and the chemical would need to be Class 2A. So moving on to a different area of disinfection within loan stores, is a number of places use hydrogen peroxide, vapour systems, ozone or ultraviolet. These are obviously performing disinfection. As far as we're aware, none of these are classified as medical devices because they are only ever directed as generic surface or room disinfection systems. They're not being claimed as medical device disinfectors. That's just not how they're marketed. But that also means they shouldn't be used on medical devices. And when you think about a lot of healthcare settings, you might have a room, but think about the things that are in that room. Something as simple as a wheelchair or a pressure alternating mattress or an articulating bed are all medical devices. So technically speaking, those items should be removed from such a room before such a disinfection system is used, because that disinfection system is not designed or accredited to be used on those medical devices. So who decides what's a medical device at the end of the day? We kind of covered this before, but I really want to highlight it again. It comes down to the manufacturer. The manufacturer decides what they want to claim about their product, and it really is up to them. But as soon as they do make those claims, then you need to look through to the regulation that then dictates what needs to happen. Now, a user can use a product outside its intended use, but they do so at their own risk. And just to give you a more tangible example, children's toys also carry CE marks for safety, and they have their own set of regulations, and then you know that when you buy a children's toy that it won't have sharp edges and so on. But that doesn't stop parents allowing their children to use other things as toys. You might let them use a pen as a toy. But if they were to injure themselves because it had a sharp edge on it, or that the ink used in it was toxic, you have no way of going back to the manufacturer and saying this was dangerous for use for my child, because you made the decision to let your child use that. And the same is true here. You can choose to use a product that's not intended for use on medical devices, but you have no way of going back to the manufacturer if in some way that damages the good or doesn't perform at the level that's required for the medical device. You are taking on all the risk if you use something outside of its intended use. It's also important to be careful about how and what manufacturers are claiming. So equipment that is marketed as generic surface cleaners or generic surface disinfectors or industrial washers, they can be used on non-medical devices. That's what they're intended for. So something like a generic bed frame is not a medical device, or touch points and work surfaces around a loan store, you can use such things, there's no problem with that. But these same devices, chemicals or machines, should not be used on medical devices, even if you have done in the past or you feel that it is safe to do so. And be careful, there are a lot of manufacturers out there who in their official marketing might say this is an industrial washer, let's say, and then on the QC will say to you, you can use this on the machines, it's fine, we've done so for many years. That won't stand up. If you had to come back and prove something just because a salesperson or anyone told you that it's just fine, that won't stand up. You need it to be documented. It should be clear in the manufacturer or seller's documentation what this product is intended for. So how can you identify whether something is medically device CE marked? Well, first of all, it needs to carry the CE mark, but bear in mind CE marks are there for a whole bunch of different safety regulations. As I mentioned before, toys carry CE marks, that doesn't make them medical devices. And also be careful that there are a number of electrical safety regulations which carry CE marks. So a device may have a CE mark on it, and that may only be related to its electrical safety. It may have nothing to do with medical device safety. So the best way to find out is to ask the seller for a declaration of conformity. This is in effect a certificate, a document which says this device is certified safe under these regulations, and it should be absolutely clear. Just as a small rule of thumb, if you're trying to identify whether something's 2A or above, what you'll see under the CE mark is 4 numbers. This is what identifies the notified body, which is the organisation which looks over the application to be CE marked. So what do you do if you can't find a compliant product? And there are certain scenarios that we're aware of where we don't think there are compliant products for that product category. And so what are you supposed to do when you can't find a compliant product with the best will in the world? And it really comes down to risk assessment and mitigation. So you want to document that you've done an exhaustive search and you could not find a compliant product, that you've identified what's the best alternative, so might comply to other regulations which are relatively good, and you should also look at how you can mitigate the risks between the non-compliance and the compliance, for instance by conducting additional testing. So what should you do now? What are the concrete steps that you should be taking? So the first thing you need to do is assess your situation, and you want to be thinking about, are you cleaning and disinfecting medical devices? Obviously if you're not, none of this applies. And are the machines and the chemicals that you're already using classified as medical devices? If they already are, you're absolutely fine, you're good to go, you don't need to change anything. And also think about if you are procuring new equipment or new chemicals, is to make this a specific requirement of the companies that are maybe tendering or going through a sales process with you. Just as a reality check, at the end of the day, we know most loan stores have decontamination machines and chemicals that aren't classified as medical devices. It's probably not all of them, but from our experience many don't. So what are you supposed to do? The most important thing is to create a roadmap to compliance. So you need to set the bar at, you want a fully compliant piece of equipment and the processes around that. And then you have a timescale which is probably usually dictated by the time it takes to get the funding. So that needs to be reasonable. There's no point in just saying, well, I'll be fully compliant in 10 years' time. That won't stand up to scrutiny. And then you need to look at the risks between where you are and where you want to be and see how they could be mitigated. And here's a couple of ideas of how you might do that. So you might opt to use compliant chemicals in a non-compliant machine. At the end of the day, a non-compliant machine and non-compliant chemicals is worse than a non-compliant machine and compliant chemicals. And changing a chemical over is a relatively easy thing to do in comparison to changing the whole machine. The next thing to look at is whether you can conduct periodic testing and validation which matches what a new compliant machine would be required to do. So it may be that your equipment as it stands actually performs at the level that's required by the regulations, and that you could prove that by performing the same testing. And so that may be an option to say, well, the equipment that I've got performs at the level that's required, although it hasn't been certified to that level, and that would be a pretty good go-between to bridge the gap. So who can help you? Well, we as BES, we can help you. We perform no obligation audits, so we can come and have a look at the equipment that you've got and the chemicals you're using and advise you how they're certified and how they ought to be certified. If you want someone more impartial, around the UK there are individuals known as Authorised Engineers for Decontamination, AEDs. These currently work across various healthcare institutions, mainly hospitals, and they advise them on what they need to be doing with their decontamination, and especially around the regulations with this. So they're all officially qualified and certified through IHEM, which is the Institute for Healthcare Engineering and Estates Management. They have a register of all the AEDs on their website, so you can freely go and find that. Here is the one that I pulled out last August, and they keep that up to date. These are all independent consultants. You can find the one that's nearest to you or contact a few and see how they can help you, see what capacity they have. But they're really set up, they know all about the different regulations and know the practicalities of working within the NHS or public funded systems. They really are a very good point to go to. A couple of useful links and emails here. Obviously you can contact the MHRA directly to make any inquiries about particular devices that you're using or looking at procuring. We've got the BES email. We'd be more than happy to answer your queries, and I'm sure IHEM would also be happy to point you in the right direction in terms of appointing an AED. So thank you for listening. I think just to kind of summarise the key points, there is an important regulation here that, to our knowledge, most loan stores are not aware of, that your decontamination equipment, your chemicals in your machines need to be medically CE marked, and they probably aren't at the moment. And you need to take steps to get to that point, and there are some fairly easy things you can do to mitigate risks in the short term and to work on a longer term plan to getting compliant machines. We at BES are more than happy to help with that, but at the very least speak to an AED. They can advise you further and get you onto the right track.